There's no better place, I think, to grapple with the relationship of race and economics than metropolitan Detroit. Many argue that Detroit is exceptional in some way, a one-industry city, a place that stands apart from other American cities because of its distinctive past. And I think that's an inaccurate way of thinking about Detroit. One can find exceptional aspects to every American city or every world city. But I think what makes Detroit so critical for grappling with the problems of economics and race and public policy today is the way in which Detroit, in fundamental aspects, resembles many other American cities, particularly the cities of the so-called Rust Belt of the Northeast and Midwest. Places with historically high rates of racial segregation in housing and in public education. Places that have been, as we've seen in the political commentary over the last couple of days, places that have been grappling for decades with the impact of the long-term flight of capital and the restructuring of the economy in this region. So the past, in other words, bears heavy weight on the present. To think about Detroit requires for a moment grappling with the ways in which not only does the history of the city weigh on the present, but how we talk about the history also weighs heavily on the present. Detroit is one of those places that is burdened with a conventional wisdom that scholars like me have spent most of the last 2 decades trying to disabuse them of. In fact, in 2013, when the city of Detroit declared bankruptcy, I pledged that summer to answer every single media query that came to me, whether it was from a small town radio station or whether it was from an international newspaper, because hardly any of the major news media in the United States or worldwide understand Detroit. Even the very finest papers, the New York Times, for example, which has excellent reporters covering domestic politics and economics, by and large covered Detroit by trotting out some of the oldest and hoariest cliches about the city's history as a way of trying to make sense of how it came to bankruptcy. The conventional wisdom about Detroit goes something like this. Until the 1960s and 1970s, Detroit was a boom town, the capital of what was arguably the most important industry in 20th century America, automobile manufacturing, that at its peak employed about 1 in every 6 working Americans directly or indirectly. Detroit was a magnet for immigrants from all over the world, from places as diverse as Syria and Poland, Scotland and Germany, Canada and Mexico, and many, many other places too numerous to list. It was also, of course, a major magnet for the refugees from the violent system of Jim Crow in the American South, seeking both political and economic opportunity. Detroit was also a classic example of America's powerful labor movement and its impact on the quality of life. Detroit was, even before there was an organized labor movement, the home of the $5 day. It was the place of the Treaty of Detroit that brought together management and the fledgling United Automobile Workers to provide some of the most generous wages and benefits in industry in the United States and set the standards for many other industries, both in Detroit and in the nation at large. Detroit was the home of the so-called embourgeoised American worker, the blue-collar worker who had made it into the middle class, who could not only afford to own usually his own home, but also sometimes a cottage on one of the lakes north of the city or even in northern Michigan. Detroit was also, in the view, its own self-view and its framing in this period, a model city of race relations. It was an alternative to the violent system of Jim Crow in the South, a place where African Americans found extraordinary opportunity. Then the conventional wisdom goes, it came all crashing down in a remarkably short period of time, dating sometime to the mid-1960s and then reaching its tragic denouement sometime in the 1970s and thereafter. In this conventional explanation of Detroit's history, the city underwent transformations that were a result of the poisonous combination of federal public policies, of union policies, of corporate mismanagement, and of locally racially divisive politics. Economics and race, in other words, came together in the conventional explanation of Detroit's woes. Detroit, by the 1960s, was hemorrhaging population and jobs, and it was riven, of course, by some of the most violent racial conflict in the nation's history. This is the moment that many look to explain Detroit's fate. Perhaps it was the public policies of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty and Great Society that sapped people's will to work through what would later be called by conservative analyst Charles Murray the perverse incentives of welfare. Perhaps it was public policies and a shift in culture that destroyed the family, and as a consequence, especially the African-American family, the conventional wisdom went, in the process exacerbating Detroit's economic woes. Perhaps it was the divisive racial politics of the 1960s and 1970s, particularly the uprising in Detroit in late July of 1967. Many pointed to Detroit's rise of a Black Power movement, and particularly point their fingers on what still remains the heart of an explanation for Detroit's troubles: the rise of the city's first African-American mayor, Coleman A. Young, who is still in the conventional wisdom, despite not just my work and the work of other scholars, but also some really diligent work by John Gallagher and Nathan Bomey for the Free Press, is blamed for poisoning racial politics in Detroit, blamed for sending Detroit spiraling down the road to fiscal mismanagement and ultimately economic collapse, is blamed ultimately for the fate of Detroit becoming a bitterly racially segregated and divided metropolitan area. The most famous symbol, and if I had a slide here, I would show you, the Joe Louis fist pointing across 8 Mile in a Detroit Free Press cartoon toward the white suburbs to the north, symbolizing what seemed to be a racial divide. Topping it all off by the mid-1970s, and here various explanations prevailed. The auto industry began its downward spiral, losing out as a result of the oil shock and the fiscal crises of the 1970s to its competition in Japan, in Germany, in Korea, and elsewhere over time. Exacerbated, if you are coming from the right, by union misrule and mismanagement and work rules and wages that were not reflective of the market conditions or demands, and by mismanagement, by the sclerotic nature of the auto industry's management, not adapting and innovating in light of major technological changes. So we have, in other words, a pretty encrusted body of conventional wisdom on Detroit's history, focusing on national politics, focusing on the auto industry, focusing on labor, and especially hinging around the question of the city's racial politics. So, how do we begin to rethink this? How do we begin to challenge a conventional wisdom? Well, first of all, bad history almost invariably leads to bad policy, right? The conventional wisdom about Detroit, the conventional wisdom that focuses on that 60s and 1970s period, continued to play out all the way through the election of this year, where you had candidates, including our president-elect, pointing to regulation and to the lack of innovation and to union wages as the source of Detroit's woes, or pointing to international trade policy from the 1990s as the source of Detroit's woes. We need to look back and grapple with the burden of the past. So let me talk about that for the next couple of minutes. First, Detroit was remade well before the crises of the 1960s and 1970s. It was remade by a combination of forces shaping the city racially, demographically, politically, and economically. Any one of these forces would be problematic for a city. But in Detroit and in many other cities, they all came together more or less simultaneously. Beginning in the 1940s and 1950s, Detroit began to see a restructuring of its core industry, the auto industry, and the archipelago of all sorts of smaller firms that fed into the auto industry, making parts and stamping and et cetera. That began well before the rise of Japanese and German competition, well before trade policy had anything to do with what was going on in the United States, when America more or less had a monopoly in major automobile production worldwide. That crisis came in the 1940s and especially the 1950s, when the auto industry began to decentralize its production away from the city, a process that some called deindustrialization, the flight of capital away from the center. First to the greenfield areas on the periphery of the metropolitan area, increasingly to other parts of the country where the auto industry was seeking to grow its market share, but also where wages and labor markets were more pliable than they were in metropolitan Detroit. Between 1948 and 1963, in other words, the 50s, when the United States was unchallenged economically in terms of its might, Detroit lost about 140,000 manufacturing jobs. This is before any substantive international competition in the auto industry. This flight of capital was accompanied by the flight of other investments away from the center of the city. That is, federal infrastructural investments in highway infrastructure that completely transformed the landscape of metropolitan America. Federal decisions, largely because of the power of Southern congressional committee leaders, to channel federal military spending away from centers like Detroit and toward places like Phoenix, which had about 40,000 people in 1940 and today is nearly the 5th largest city in the United States. So the economic transformations that remade Detroit were already well underway, way before the oil shocks and the stagflation and the rise of international competition and globalization in the last quarter of the 20th century. Those economic changes affected people all over Detroit, but they fell particularly hard on African Americans. And I should say here as a very quick aside, since there's been a lot of talk about the working class, the deindustrialized, bitter working class today in our current political discourse and political debates, I should note that the notion commonplace in academia and in journalism and political analysis that working class equals white, right? The idea that when we use blue collar or working class, we're referring to white men overlooks the fact that the blue collar segment of Detroit was increasingly diverse. Indeed, at the end of World War II, at the beginning of World War II, about 3% of the auto industry workforce was African American. By the end of World War II, about 15%. By 1960, about 18%. And so when we think about deindustrialization and job loss, we have to focus on the ways in which this was a phenomenon that affected workers of all backgrounds. More than that, though, the job loss fell disproportionately on African American workers because of the persistence, despite civil rights activism and legislation, the persistence of workplace discrimination. In the early 1960s, the Ford Motor Company was asked to do essentially a census of its workforce. And the Civil Rights Commission, which was gathering data, wanted information on how many African Americans were at the top ranks of Ford, beginning with skilled workers on the shop floor, going up to engineers and white-collar workers. And the percentage of African Americans in any of those positions was close to 0. Discrimination meant that African Americans were confined in the meanest and dirtiest jobs, the jobs at the bottom of the economic ladder, the jobs that were most likely to be replaced when the auto industry was introducing new labor-saving technologies during the 1950s and 1960s. Those entry-level jobs began to disappear, and African Americans bore a disproportionate burden of that job loss. Discrimination, in other words, mattered enormously. Compounding it was the persistence of residential segregation by race in the metropolitan area. This came from a number of different sources. It came from the top. The federal government created programs in the 1930s to promote the expansion of the home development, the home construction industry, and to promote the ideal of home ownership. Essentially, the federal government created the modern home finance sector, the one that, of course, came cratering down, also with devastating effects on Detroit in 2008. This home finance sector was premised on the application of actuarial science to the housing market in Detroit and in the metropolitan area. Again, something that was not distinctive to Detroit, but was being done nationwide. The Federal Housing Administration, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and the Veterans Administration made it possible for the dramatic expansion of homeownership rates in Detroit, but mostly for whites. African Americans were mostly excluded from the conventional mortgage market as a consequence of these federal programs. Those burdens wouldn't be lifted until the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, but continued to shape the practices of lenders into the 1970s, the 80s, the 90s, and beyond, including in the period when predatory lenders, taking advantage of the long history of the lack of capital and real estate, flowed into Detroit neighborhoods in the early 2000s, preying especially on African American would-be home buyers or folks who wanted to refinance their homes, taking advantage of the fact that these neighborhoods had mostly been a desert for conventional financing before then. Next, the segregation of metropolitan Detroit was also the consequence of public policies at the local level. I will single out just for a moment Mayor Albert Cobo from the 1950s, who was responsible for essentially carving out Detroit into an apartheid zone of public housing confined, segregated by race, and keeping them away from predominantly white neighborhoods, but also the power of a politically organized, incredibly effective homeowners movement in Detroit that was responsible for preserving the racial homogeneity of their neighborhoods. There were more than 200 violent attacks on the first and second African American families to move into neighborhoods all around Detroit that I was able to find just between the mid-40s and the mid-60s. Compounding that was the action of the real estate industry, one of the most powerful and still relatively understudied industries in shaping our metropolitan areas. I'm writing a book about it now, about it nationwide. The real estate industry was responsible for excluding African Americans from large segments of the metropolitan metropolitan housing market. We look out onto metropolitan America today, and the conventional wisdom is something like this: birds of a feather flock together. People live where they want to live as a result of the exercise of their individual choice. They're making economically rational decisions based on the bundle of resources that they can find in communities they want to move into and how much they're willing to pay for it. It's a classic free market explanation for the housing market. However, in metropolitan Detroit, as in most of the United States, all the way up until the present day, the housing market is far, far, far from a free market, profoundly shaped by past and present consequences of segregation. Next, the segregation in metropolitan Detroit's housing market had all sorts of pernicious consequences. First, in dividing the metropolitan area very deeply by race, metropolitan Detroit has been in the top 5 most racially segregated cities in the United States since the 1920s, and it remains there. Next, however, the allocation of resources through the real estate market has exacerbated other forms of racial inequality. 1, today, the hugest gap between African Americans and whites is the gap in household assets or wealth. A large chunk of households' assets or wealth is in real estate. Because the real estate market was segregated and values unevenly distributed across the metropolitan area, African Americans are far less likely to have high assets. In fact, today, the average African American household has about $5,000 in wealth. The average white household, about $133,000. An enormous gap and a reminder of the ways in which past housing segregation and housing policy continues to shape opportunity in the present. Finally, housing segregation balkanized the metropolitan area politically and economically with devastating long-term consequences. The separation of African Americans and whites into different communities with different tax bases, with different access to jobs, with different economic opportunities, with different commercial and retail, and especially with different systems of public education, has meant that there is not an equal distribution of either economic or educational resources across the metropolitan area. The sociologist Charles Tilly, in writing about what he calls durable inequalities, describes what he calls resource hoarding. That is, whites living in the suburbs of metropolitan Detroit and most other American cities have hoarded resources, public goods, particularly public education, leaving those in central cities and in more impoverished communities without. Finally, in metropolitan Detroit, those patterns of segregation have reinforced the political divisions that we have seen play out so poisonously in American politics since the middle of the 20th century. In other words, if we take a look at Detroit today, we need to understand not the mythological Detroit of greatness and of racial integration and of job opportunity, but the real Detroit of unequal distribution of goods and resources, of unequal opportunities, of political fragmentation and division, and of intense racial conflict. Until we come to grips with those aspects of Detroit, we will not be able to come to grips with the really pressing issues that still face the city. Downtown redevelopment is not going to address those issues fundamentally. Bringing in hipsters and wealthy suburbanites to buy properties in the cities is not going to deal with those inequalities. Creating small-scale experiments and charters and other public education in our cities is not going to deal with the maldistribution, the profound maldistribution of educational resources across space. We need, in other words, to grapple with the burdens of the past to come to terms with both the opportunities and the unresolved issues in the present. Thank you.